Rambler number 4, Saturday, March 31st, 1750. Enjoying both profit and delight in one. Creech. The works of fiction with which the present generation seems more particularly delighted are such as exhibit life in its true state, diversified only by accidents that daily happen in the world, and influenced by passions and qualities which are really to be found in conversing with mankind. This kind of writing may be termed not improperly the comedy of romance, and is to be conducted nearly by the rules of comic poetry. Its province is to bring about natural events by easy means, and to keep up curiosity without the help of wonder. It is therefore precluded from the machines and expedients of the heroic romance, and can neither employ giants to snatch away a lady from the nuptial rites, nor knights to bring her back from captivity. It can neither bewilder its personages in deserts, nor lodge them in imaginary castles. I remember a remark made by Scaliger upon Pontanus, and all his writings, that all his writings are filled with the same images, and that if you take from him his lilies and his roses, his satires and his dyads, he will have nothing left that can be called poetry. In like manner, almost all the fictions of the last age will vanish, if you deprive them of a hermit and a wood, a battle, and a shipwreck. Why this wild strain of imagination found reception so long in polite and learned ages, it is not easy to conceive. But we cannot wonder that while readers could be procured, the authors were willing to continue it. And when a man had by practice gained some fluency of language, he had no further care than to retire to his closet, let loose his invention, and heat his mind with incredibilities. A book was thus produced without fear of criticism, without the toil of study, without knowledge of nature or acquaintance with life. The task of our present writers is very different. It requires, together with that learning which is to be gained from books, that experience which can never be attained by solitary diligence, but must rise from general converse, and an accurate observation of the living world. Their performances have, as Horace expresses in Plus Honoris Quantum Veniae Minus, little indulgence and therefore more difficulty. They are engaged in portraits of which everyone knows the original, and can detect any deviation from exactness of resemblance. Other writings are safe, except from the malice of learning, but these are in danger from every common reader, as the slipper ill executed or censured by the shoemaker who happens to stop in his way at the Venus of Apelles. But the fear of not approving as just copiers of human manners is not the most important concern that an author of this sort ought to have before him. These books are written chiefly to the young, the ignorant, and the idle, to whom they serve as lectures of conduct and introductions into life. They are the entertainments of minds unfurnished with ideas, and therefore easily susceptible of impressions, not fixed by principles, and therefore easily following the current of fancy, not informed by experience, and consequently open to every false suggestion and partial account. That the highest degree of reverence should be paid to youth, and that nothing indecent should be suffered to approach their eyes or ears, are precepts extorted by sense and virtue from an ancient writer, by no means eminent for chastity of thought. The same kind, though not the same degree of caution, is required in everything which is laid before them, to secure them from unjust prejudices, perverse opinions, and incongruous combinations of images. In the romances formerly written, every transaction and sentiment was so remote from all that passes among men, that the reader was in very little danger of making any application to himself. the virtues and crimes were equally beyond the sphere of activity, and he amused himself with heroes and with traitors, deliverers, and persecutors, as with beings of another species, whose actions were regulated upon motives of their own, and who had neither faults nor excellencies in common with himself. But when an adventurer is levelled with the rest of the world, and acts in such scenes of the universal drama as may be the lot of every other man, young spectators fix their eyes upon him with closer attention, and hope by observing his behavior and success to regulate their own practices when they shall be engaged in the like parts. For this reason, these familiar histories may perhaps be made of greater use than the solemnities of professed morality, and convey the knowledge of vice and virtue with more efficacy than axioms and definitions. But if the power of example is so great as to take possession of the memory by a kind of violence and produce effects almost without the intervention of the will, care ought to be taken that, when the choice is unrestrained, the best examples only should be exhibited, and that which is likely to operate so strongly should not be mischievous or uncertain in its effects. The chief advantage which these fictions have over real life is their authors are at liberty, though not to invent, yet to select objects and to cull from the mass of mankind those individuals upon which the attention ought most to be employed. As a diamond, though it cannot be made, may be polished by art and placed in such a situation as to display that luster which before was buried among common stones. It is justly considered as the greatest excellency of art to imitate nature, but it is necessary to distinguish those parts of nature which are most proper for imitation. Greater care is still required in representing life, which is so often discolored by passion, or deformed by wickedness. If the world be promiscuously described, I cannot see of what use it can be to read the account, or why it may not be as safe as to turn the eye immediately upon mankind as upon a mirror, which shows all that presents itself without discrimination. It is therefore not a sufficient vindication of a character that it is drawn as it appears, for many characters ought never to be drawn, nor of a narrative that the train of events is agreeable to observation and experience, for that observation which is called knowledge of the world will be found much more frequently to make men cunning than good. The purpose of these writings is surely not only to show mankind, but to provide that they may be seen hereafter with less hazard, to teach the means of avoiding the snares which are laid by treachery and innocence, without infusing any wish for that superiority with which the betrayer flatters his vanity, to give the power of contradicting fraud without the temptation to practice it, to initiate youth by mock encounters in the art of necessary deference, and to increase prudence without impairing virtue. Many writers, for the sake of following nature, so mingle good and bad qualities in their principal personages that they are both equally conspicuous, and as we accompany them through their adventures with delight, and are led by degrees to interest ourselves in their favor, we lose the abhorrence of their faults, because they do not hinder our pleasure, or perhaps regard them with some kindness for being united with so much merit. There have been men, indeed, splendidly wicked, whose endowments threw a brightness on the crimes, and whom scarce any villainy made perfectly detestable, because they never could be wholly divested of their excellencies. But such have been in all ages the great corrupters of the world, and their resemblance ought no more to be preserved than the art of murdering without pain. Some have advanced, without due attention to the consequences of this notion, that certain virtues have their corresponding faults, and therefore that to exhibit either a part is to deviate from probability. Thus men are observed by Swift to be grateful in the same degree as they are resentful. This principle, with others of the same kind, supposes man to act from a brute impulse, and pursue a certain degree of inclination without any choice of the object. For otherwise, though it should be allowed that gratitude and resentment arise from the same constitution of the passions, it follows not that they will be equally indulged when reason is consulted. Yet unless that consequence be admitted, this sagacious maxim becomes an empty sound, without any relation to practice or to life. Nor is it evident that even the first motions of these effects are always in the same proportion, for pride, which produces quickness of resentment, will obstruct gratitude by unwillingness to admit that inferiority which objection implies, and it is very unlikely that he who cannot think he receives a favor will acknowledge or repay it. It is of the utmost importance to mankind that positions of this tendency should be laid open and confuted, for while men consider good and evil as springing from the same root, they will spare the one for the sake of the other, and in judging, if not of others, at least of themselves, will be apt to estimate their virtues by their vices. To this fatal error all those will contribute who confound the colors of right and wrong, and instead of helping to settle their boundaries, mix them with so much art that no common mind is able to disunite them. In narratives where historical veracity has no place, I cannot discover why there should not be exhibited the most perfect idea of virtue not angelical nor above probability, for what we cannot credit we shall never imitate, but the highest and purest that humanity can reach, which exercised in such trials as the various revolutions of things shall bring upon it, may, by conquering some calamities and ensnaring others, teach us what we hope and what we can perform. Vice, for vice is necessary to be shown, should always be discussed, nor should the graces be gaiety, or the dignity of courage be so united with it as to reconcile it to the mind. Wherever it appears, it should raise hatred by the malignity of its practices, and contempt by the meanness of its stratagems. For while it is supported by either parts or spirit, it will be seldom heartily abhorred. The Roman tyrant was content to be hated if he was but feared, and there are thousands of the readers of romances willing to be thought wicked, if they may be allowed to be wits. It is therefore to be steadily inculcated that virtue is of the highest proof of understanding, and the only solid basis of greatness, and that vice is the natural consequence of narrow thought, and that it begins in mistake and ends in ignominy. And there's a footnote here. This excellent paper was occasioned by the popularity of Roderick Random and Tom Jones, which appeared about this time, and have been the models of that species of romance now known to be by the more common name of novel. Okay, that was Rambler number 4. Now I ran across something interesting. Yesterday when I read Rambler 3, I struggled with Rambler 1. I struggled with Rambler 2. I think I get the general idea, but not the details. Rambler 3 I also struggled with. But then after I recorded this and uploaded it, I read it on my way to work yesterday. I listened to it on my way to work yesterday as I was driving. Normally I ride a motorcycle, but I was in a car, and I understood it better than I did before. I think it was because I had read it in my own words, and then I listened to it in my own words. And listening to my own words, I didn't have to engage the part of my mind to read and do that, and it made sense to me. So I'm going to try to summarize Rambler 3 for you now. And then I'm not going to try to summarize Rambler 4. I'll try to summarize Rambler 4 in tomorrow's reading ahead of Rambler 5, if that makes any sense. Hopefully this will make sense. Rambler 3 yesterday, so enough for Rambler 4. Rambler 3 yesterday was referring to how works of efforts of literature will be determined, how there's the critic, and how the critic's mind in the current ages will discern. It's kind of a gauntlet that writing has to run through in its own modern age. Envy and criticism and the like tend to weed things out. What rises to fame may be something that simply has more touching with the common interest at the time. and Johnson points this out with a kind of a fable that he creates, not a fable, but kind of like a character, the character of criticism, which he describes, I think, as the daughter of truth. And criticism is a woman who has a staff, and on the staff there's two ends. The one end is kind of gives a blessing of if touched with, if a man or woman creates a piece of literature, and if criticism reviews it and touches it with the one end of the staff, then it becomes immortal. It lasts for the ages. And if she touches it with the other end, then it dies. And those two ends of the staff are covered with something that have those signifying elements to it. But what he said is that, in fact, that was a corrupted mechanism, probably due to the corrupting influence of things other than the true value of things, and that instead it's better left to time. That time is a more discerning and more honest judge of art and literature than criticism. And so never mind the critic. Your work will be determined by time, whether you will be remembered or forgotten. That's what I got from Rambler 3. Quite an interesting essay. It's interesting also to point out that these essays don't have titles, so you kind of go with that as well. So I'll leave it with that. Tomorrow, Rambler 5. Take care.